The mansion had been silent for 18 days. Not the peaceful silence of sleep, but the suffocating quiet of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. The staff moved through the marble hallways like ghosts, speaking in whispers, avoiding the East Wing entirely, where a little girl hadn't stopped crying since her mother's funeral. They'd tried everything: doctors with gentle voices and cold stethoscopes, specialists who flew in from Rome and Milan with degrees on their walls and certainty in their eyes. Her grandmother's prayers, whispered in Latin over rosary beads worn smooth by decades of devotion. Her father's desperate bribes, toys, candy, promises of puppies and ponies and anything at all if she would just stop crying. Nothing worked. Lucia Vitale was 4 years old, and she was drowning in a grief too big for her small body to hold. The nannies came and went like seasons. The first one lasted a week before she packed her bags with shaking hands and refused to say why. The second made it 3 days. The third didn't even survive a single night. She'd fled at 2 in the morning, mascara streaking down her cheeks, muttering about demons and possessed children. And then the new maid sang. It wasn't supposed to happen. Sera Ferrante was hired to polish silver and press linens, not to enter the family quarters. She was nobody, just another invisible body in a black uniform, another pair of hands to scrub floors and fold sheets. But when she heard the sobbing through the nursery door, that raw, hiccuping wail that seemed to shake the very walls, she didn't think. She just opened the door. What she did in the next 3 minutes would bring the most powerful man in Sicily to his knees. This is the story of how a maid with nothing became everything to a man who had everything but couldn't save the one person who mattered. But it didn't start with a lullaby. It started with a lie. 6 weeks earlier, the employment agency smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting a sickly yellow pallor over everything they touched. Sera Ferrante sat in a plastic chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight, her application form trembling slightly in her fingers. She'd filled out dozens of these forms over the past month. Housekeeper, cleaner, caretaker, cook. She checked every box, agreed to every condition, lowered her expectations with each rejection until they scraped the floor. Ferrante? The woman behind the counter had the voice of someone who had long ago stopped caring about the parade of desperate faces that passed through her office. She didn't look up from her computer screen. Says here you have no references. My previous employer passed away. Sera kept her voice steady, even though her hands weren't. I cared for her for 6 years. She was like family to me. Family doesn't put food on the table. The woman finally looked at her, a quick, dismissive scan that cataloged Sera's worn coat with its fraying cuffs, her sensible shoes with their scuffed toes, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. You speak English? Fluently, also French and Sicilian dialect. The woman's eyebrows rose half an inch, the first sign of interest she'd shown. The old dialect? Nobody speaks that anymore, not even the old folks in the villages. My grandmother did. She raised me after my parents died. Sera didn't add that Nonna Julia had been the one who taught her everything. How to cook meals from nothing. How to clean houses until they sparkled. How to survive on pride when there was nothing else left. How to disappear when men with guns came looking for her father's debts. The woman turned back to her screen, her fingers clicking across the keyboard. There's one position available. A villa outside Palermo, the Vitale estate. She paused and something flickered across her face. Caution maybe, or warning. They've been through 4 housekeepers in 2 months. The pay is exceptional. The family is difficult. Sarah had heard the name Vitale. Everyone in Sicily had. Marco Vitale wasn't officially connected to anything illegal. His businesses were construction, shipping, wine exports, legitimate enterprises with legitimate paperwork and legitimate tax returns. But the newspapers called him the Shadow of Palermo. The last businessman who'd tried to undercut his shipping contracts had been found floating in the harbor with concrete shoes. Allegedly. Nothing was ever proven. Nothing was ever proven with men like Marco Vitale. "I'll take it," Sarah said. She needed the money. Her grandmother's medical bills had eaten through everything. The savings account, the emergency fund, the jar of cash hidden beneath the floorboards. The apartment was 3 months behind on rent, and the landlord's patience had run out 2 weeks ago. She'd sold Nonna's jewelry first, then her own, then the furniture, piece by piece, until she was sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a room she couldn't afford, eating bread and olives and counting the days until she'd be out on the street. The Vitale estate was not a miracle, but it was a paycheck. And right now, that was enough. The villa rose from the Sicilian hills like a beautiful wound. White stone walls that gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. Terracotta roof tiles weathered by centuries of salt wind. Surrounded by olive groves that stretched to the horizon in neat, silver-green rows. Iron gates marked the entrance, flanked by stone lions with snarling faces and men who watched everything with empty eyes. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday morning with one suitcase and a heart full of quiet terror. The drive up had taken her past guardhouses and checkpoints, past men with barely concealed weapons and radios crackling with coded messages. This wasn't just a villa. It was a fortress. The head housekeeper met her at the servants' entrance, a severe woman named Signora Benedetti with steel-gray hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her eyes were the color of slate and just as warm. "You will not speak unless spoken to," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "You will not enter the family quarters under any circumstances. You will not make eye contact with Don Vitale or any of his associates. You will not ask questions about the family, the business, or anything you might see or hear within these walls. Is that clear?" "Yes, Signora." The previous girl asked questions. Signora Benedetti's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She's no longer with us." Sarah didn't ask what that meant. She was learning to stop asking. Her room was in the staff quarters at the back of the villa. Small but clean, with whitewashed walls and a narrow bed covered in crisp linen. A single window overlooked the lemon trees, their branches heavy with fruit that filled the air with sweetness. She unpacked her single suitcase. 2 spare uniforms, a nightgown worn soft from years of washing, her grandmother's rosary with its wooden beads and tarnished silver cross, and a photograph of Nonna Giulia that she tucked beneath her pillow where she could touch it in the dark. Then she went to work. The villa was enormous, 47 rooms according to Signora Benedetti, though Sarah suspected even that number was an undercount. There were wings and annexes and hidden passages, rooms that seemed to lead nowhere, and staircases that spiraled into shadow. Sarah was assigned to the West Wing, the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books, the formal dining room with its crystal chandeliers and table that could seat 30, the gallery filled with Renaissance paintings and marble sculptures, worth more than she would earn in 10 lifetimes. She polished silver until her fingers ached, and her reflection stared back at her from every surface. She pressed linens until the steam burned her wrists and the smell of starch filled her lungs. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees until her back screamed for mercy, and through it all, she made herself invisible. It was a skill she'd learned young, how to fade into the background, how to become part of the furniture, how to exist in the spaces between notice. The other staff barely acknowledged her. The family didn't know she existed, and that was exactly how it should be. But she heard things. The staff whispered constantly in corners and corridors, in the kitchen over morning coffee, and in the laundry room over afternoon ironing. They whispered about Don Vitale's wife, Elena, who had died in a car accident 6 weeks ago. A twisted wreck of metal on a mountain road, a tragedy that had made headlines across the island. They whispered about the little girl who had been in the back seat, who had survived without a scratch on her body, but hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. They whispered about the master of the house, who hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch, who paced the halls at night like a ghost, who had fired the last 3 nannies for failing to stop his daughter's tears. "The child is broken," the cook muttered one evening, stirring a pot of soup with more force than necessary, "and he's breaking himself trying to fix her. Mark my words, this house is cursed now, cursed by grief." Sarah said nothing. It wasn't her place. But late at night, when the villa finally stilled and even the guard's footsteps faded to silence, she could hear it. The crying, distant at first, muffled by walls and doors and the vast space between the servants' quarters and the family wing, but unmistakable. A little girl sobbing for a mother who would never come back. Sarah pressed the rosary to her lips and tried to sleep. She never could. She saw him for the first time on her 3rd day. Sarah was polishing the banister of the main staircase, an elaborate sweep of carved mahogany that curved upward like a frozen wave. It was delicate work, requiring her to be perfectly still whenever anyone passed, to become part of the architecture itself. She heard him before she saw him, the heavy tread of expensive shoes on marble, the murmur of men's voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Then the front doors swung open, and Marco Vitale walked through. She'd seen photographs in the newspapers, grainy black and white images that accompanied articles about business deals and charity galas. But photographs couldn't capture the way the air itself seemed to shift when he entered a room, the way the shadows leaned toward him like plants toward sunlight, the way every person in his orbit held their breath without realizing they were doing it. He was taller than she'd expected, broader. His suit was immaculate, charcoal wool that probably cost more than her yearly salary. But there was nothing soft about him. Every line of his body suggested coiled tension, controlled violence, a predator wearing the skin of a businessman. His eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and cold and utterly without mercy. When they swept the foyer, Sarah felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. He didn't see her. She was furniture, wallpaper, less than nothing. But she saw him, and what she saw made her chest tight with something she couldn't name. He looked exhausted, not the tiredness of a long day or a sleepless night, but the bone-deep depletion of a man who had stopped sleeping entirely, stopped eating, stopped doing anything except surviving from one moment to the next. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his stubble. His eyes were red-rimmed, haunted by shadows that had nothing to do with the lighting. "Where is she?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel scraping over glass. One of his men, a giant with a shaved head and shoulders like a bull, spoke carefully, the way one might address a wounded animal. "The nursery, Don Vitale. The new nanny arrived this morning." A pause. "She lasted 4 hours. She left crying." Marco closed his eyes, just for a moment, a single heartbeat of weakness that Sarah suspected no one else was meant to witness. And in that moment, she saw something she wasn't supposed to see. Desperation. Pure, raw, human desperation. Then his eyes opened, and the mask slammed back into place. "Find another one," he said, his voice flat and cold. There has to be someone in this goddamn country who can help my daughter. He started up the stairs, his footsteps heavy with a weariness that seemed to go all the way to his bones. He passed within 3 feet of Sarah, close enough that she could have reached out and touched the sleeve of his jacket. She kept her head down, her hands still, her breath shallow. But as he moved past, she caught his scent. Expensive cologne, something woody and warm, layered over something darker. Whiskey, sleeplessness, grief. He disappeared into the east wing and the house exhaled. Sarah's hands were shaking. She didn't know why. That night the crying was worse than ever. Sarah lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant wails echo through the villa's stone corridors. The sound seemed to seep through the walls themselves, carried by some acoustic trick of the old architecture, until it felt like the grief was everywhere, inescapable. It had been going on for hours. The sobs were ragged now, broken, the sound of a child who had exhausted herself with crying but couldn't stop. Couldn't find the off switch for her own pain. Sarah pressed the pillow over her ears. It didn't help. Nothing helped. "It's not your place," she told herself. "You're just the maid. You're nobody. Stay invisible. Stay safe. Stay employed." But her grandmother's voice whispered through her memory, soft and warm and impossibly present. "When a child cries, Sarah Mia, you answer. Always. No matter what." Sarah didn't know she was moving until her feet hit the cold stone floor. She pulled her gray cardigan around her thin nightgown and crept through the silent corridors. The east wing was forbidden. Signora Benedetti had made that abundantly clear. Entering the family quarters was grounds for immediate dismissal. Or worse, though no one would say what worse meant. But the crying drew her forward like a thread pulling at her ribs, like a hook lodged somewhere beneath her heart. She couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to. The nursery door was ajar, a sliver of soft golden light spilling into the hallway. The sobbing was louder here, desperate, inconsolable, the sound of a heart breaking over and over again. Sarah peered through the gap. The room was beautiful, a princess's dream made real. Hand-painted murals covered the walls, depicting fairy tale scenes of castles and unicorns and dancing butterflies. A canopy bed stood in the center, draped in white lace that floated like clouds. Enough toys to fill a shop lined the shelves, dolls and stuffed animals and music boxes, and everything a child could ever want. But the little girl on the bed noticed none of it. She was curled into a tight ball beneath the blankets, her small body shaking with sobs, her face buried in a worn stuffed rabbit that was dark with tears. The rabbit had been white once, maybe, with floppy ears and a pink bow around its neck. Now it was gray and matted, one ear coming loose at the seam, stuffing visible where the fabric had worn thin, loved almost to destruction. There was no one else in the room, no nanny, no maid, no guard, just a 4-year-old girl drowning in her own grief, alone in a palace of toys that couldn't bring her mother back. Sarah's hand moved to the door before she could stop it. "Don't," screamed the voice of self-preservation. "You'll be fired. You'll be thrown out. You'll be back on the streets with nothing and no one. Or worse, don't." But the child's sobs hitched, turned into that horrible gasping sound that meant she couldn't breathe. And Sarah stopped thinking entirely. She pushed open the door. The hinges didn't creak. Small mercies. She crossed the room slowly, carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to approach wounded animals. No sudden movements, no loud sounds, nothing that might startle or frighten. Just presence, just patience, just being there. She sank down on the floor beside the bed, close enough to touch but not touching. just present. Lucia looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face blotchy with tears, her dark curls tangled and wild around her face. She looked like a drowned thing, a creature pulled from deep water and left, gasping on the shore. For a moment, she just stared at Sarah, this stranger in her room, this intruder in her grief. Then she screamed, "No, go away. I don't want you. I want Mama. I want Mama." Sarah didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't react at all except to remain exactly where she was, steady as a stone in a river. "I know," she said softly. "I know you want her." Lucia hurled the rabbit at her with all the force her small arm could muster. "You don't know. Nobody knows. You're not my mama. Go away." Sarah caught the rabbit gently, cradling it in her lap like something precious. She looked at it, the worn velvet, the loose ear, the matted fur stiff with tears. This rabbit had been held through 1,000 nightmares, 1,000 fevers, 1,000 small terrors. It knew this child's heart. "When I was small," Sarah said quietly, "smaller than you, my mama went away too." Lucia's screams faltered, hiccuped into something almost like silence. "I cried just like you. Every night. So hard I couldn't breathe. So hard I thought I would die from it." Sarah smoothed the rabbit's fur with gentle fingers. "My grandmother would sit with me, just like this, on the floor beside my bed. She never told me to stop crying. She never said it would be okay. She just stayed." Lucia's breath was still ragged, but she wasn't screaming anymore. Her huge gray eyes, her father's eyes, Sarah realized with a jolt, were fixed on Sarah's face with something like desperate hope. "And sometimes," Sarah continued, "when the crying got too big to hold, she would sing." Sarah closed her eyes, drew a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere below her heart, and began to sing. "Dormi, dormi, piccina mia." The old Sicilian lullaby rose through the room like smoke, like incense, like prayer. The words were ancient, passed down through generations of mothers and grandmothers, syllables that hadn't been spoken in polite society for 100 years. The dialect was thick and rolling, musical in a way that modern Italian could never match. "Lusuli è stanco, la luna brilla." Lucia's sobs slowed. Her breathing deepened. Her small hand crept out from beneath the blankets, reaching blindly for the rabbit, and Sarah placed it gently in her palm. "Chiudi l'occhiuzzi. Dormi stanotte." By the third verse, Lucia was still. By the fourth, her eyes had closed. By the fifth, she was asleep, truly asleep, not the fitful unconsciousness of exhaustion, but the peaceful slumber of a child who had finally found safe harbor. Sarah finished the song, let the last note fade into silence, brushed a curl from Lucia's damp forehead with fingers that trembled only slightly, and looked up. Marco Vitale was standing in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His face was in shadow, half hidden by the darkness of the hallway behind him, but his body was rigid. His hands gripped the doorframe like he might fall without its support, knuckles white with the force of his hold. Sarah rose to her feet, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Don Vitale, I'm so sorry. I know I'm not supposed to be here. I heard her crying and I didn't think. Please, I'll leave. What was that?" His voice was strange, thick and rough, like something was caught in his throat. The lullaby. It's an old Sicilian song my grandmother used to. I know what it is." He stepped into the room, into the light, and Sarah's breath caught in her chest like a bird in a cage. There were tears on Marco Vitale's face, the most powerful man in Sicily, the shadow of Palermo, the man who made other men disappear with a word and a nod. He was crying, silently, helplessly, tears tracking down his stubbled cheeks like they'd been waiting years to fall. "My mother," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "My mother used to sing that when I was small, when I had nightmares." He took another step forward, then another, until he was standing at the foot of his daughter's bed, staring down at her sleeping face with an expression of such raw, shattered hope that it hurt to witness. "I haven't heard those words in 20 years. I thought I'd forgotten them. I thought—" He couldn't finish. His hand rose to cover his eyes, and his shoulders shook once, hard, before he forced himself still. "She's sleeping?" His voice broke like glass. "She's actually sleeping." "Yes, Don Vitale." He looked at Sarah then, really looked, past the maid's uniform, past the invisibility she'd worked so hard to perfect. His storm-gray eyes searched her face like she held answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Ferrante." "Sarah." He said it like a prayer, like a lifeline, like the first breath after drowning. "Don't leave." It wasn't a request. The next morning, Sarah was summoned to Don Vitale's study at 7 o'clock sharp. Signora Benedetti delivered the message with a face carefully blank of expression, though her eyes were sharp with curiosity and something else. Warning, maybe, or fear. The walk through the villa felt endless, each footstep echoing off the marble floors like a countdown to something Sarah couldn't name. She'd barely slept, replaying the events of the night before, in an endless loop. The lullaby, the sleeping child, the tears on a powerful man's face. The two words that had sounded like both a command and a plea. Don't leave. The study was at the heart of the villa, a dark, masculine room of leather and mahogany, and walls lined with books that looked like they'd never been opened. Hunting trophies hung between the shelves, the heads of stags and boars, their glass eyes watching everything with eternal patience. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface bare except for a single lamp that cast a pool of golden light. Marco Vitale sat behind the desk, but he rose when Sarah entered. That small gesture, standing for a servant, surprised her more than anything else. Powerful men didn't stand for people like her. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. "Please." She sat. The chair was soft, expensive, and she perched on its edge like she might need to flee at any moment. He didn't sit back down. Instead, he moved to the window, his back to her, his silhouette framed against the morning light that filtered through the olive groves outside. He was silent for a long moment, and Sarah found herself studying the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hands clasped behind his back, the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a dying fire. "My wife died 6 weeks ago." His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man reciting facts he'd repeated so many times they'd lost all meaning. "A car accident on the mountain road above Taormina. The brakes failed. The car went through the guardrail and fell 200 feet. He paused. "They told me it was quick. They tell you that because they think it helps." A short, bitter laugh. "It doesn't." Sarah's chest constricted, but she said nothing. There was nothing to say. Lucia was in the car, in the back seat. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. She watched her mother die, watched the car fall, watched the world turn upside down and shatter into pieces. He turned from the window, and Sarah saw the devastation in his eyes, the sleepless nights, the unanswered prayers, the helpless rage of a man who could buy anything except the one thing he needed. "She hasn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since. She screams. She cries. She calls for her mother until her voice gives out, and then she calls some more. He moved to the desk but didn't sit, just stood there, his palms flat on the polished wood, his head bowed. The doctors want to medicate her. My mother wants to send her to a convent. The nannies, he shook his head. The nannies' last days, sometimes hours, they can't reach her. No one can reach her. He looked up and his gray eyes locked onto Sarah's with an intensity that made her want to look away. But you did. In 15 minutes, you did what no one else could do in 6 weeks. You made her sleep. He straightened, crossing his arms over his chest. How? Sarah thought of her grandmother, of small hands gripping her fingers in the dark, of the lullaby that had been sung through generations of grief, passed from mother to daughter like a sacred inheritance. I understood her, she said simply. I lost my mother too, young, before I was ready. Not that anyone's ever ready. She met his eyes. I know what it feels like when the world ends and everyone keeps expecting you to survive it. To move on. To be okay. When you're not okay, and you don't know if you'll ever be okay again. Something shifted in Marco's face, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the monster. I want to hire you, he said, as Lucia's caretaker, full-time, permanent. I'm not a nanny, Don Vitale. I have no training, no credentials. I don't need training. I don't need credentials. He took a step toward her. I need someone who can reach my daughter. Someone she'll let in. He stopped in front of her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I'll triple your current salary. You'll have your own quarters in the East Wing next to Lucia's room. Access to anything you need. Clothes, books, supplies. Name your terms. Sarah should have said yes immediately. The money alone would solve everything. The debts, the apartment, the crushing weight of survival that had pressed down on her for so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. But something made her hesitate. There are things you should know, she said carefully. About my past. My family, I know. Marco cut her off. I know your father was Giovanni Ferranti. I know he owed money to people he shouldn't have owed money to. Gambling debts, mostly. Some business deals gone wrong. I know he died when you were 7, shot in an alley behind a bar in Catania. I know your mother followed him a year later. Grief, they said, though the pills in her hand told a different story. I know your grandmother raised you in a village outside the city until she passed 6 months ago. And you've been surviving on nothing ever since. He watched her face, cataloging her reactions with those cold gray eyes. I know everything, Sarah. Her blood went cold. Then you know I'm not the kind of person who should be in your house. My father's debts. Your father's debts died with him. His enemies have forgotten his name. You're not a threat to me or my family. He paused. But you are, apparently the only person on this entire island who can help my daughter. So I'll ask you one more time. Will you stay? Sarah looked up at him, at this man who commanded empires, who made grown men tremble with a glance, who held the power of life and death in his hands. And she saw what she'd seen in the nursery doorway the night before, beneath the tears and the exhaustion and the armor. A father breaking apart, piece by piece, watching his child drown and unable to save her. Yes, she said, I'll stay. Something shifted in his face, relief, like a man finally reaching shore after too long at sea. Gratitude, raw and unguarded, and something else, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't want to examine. Thank you, he said, and then, quieter, almost to himself, I'll try to be worthy of that yes. The next 3 weeks were a revelation. Sarah moved into a suite adjoining Lucia's nursery. 3 rooms that were larger than her entire apartment in Catania, with silk curtains and antique furniture, and windows that overlooked the Mediterranean, sparkling in the distance. She was given a wardrobe of simple but well-made clothes, an expense account at the village shops, and one single directive: make Lucia whole again. It wasn't easy. The little girl's grief was a wild animal, unpredictable and fierce. Some days she clung to Sarah like a lifeline, her small fingers digging into Sarah's arms hard enough to leave bruises, her face pressed against Sarah's chest as she sobbed out her loss. Other days she raged, throwing toys, screaming until her voice went hoarse, pounding her small fists against the walls and the floor, and anything else within reach. She told Sarah she hated her, that she wanted her to leave, that she wanted to die so she could see Mama again. Sarah weathered it all. She sang the lullabies, not just the one from that first night, but others her grandmother had taught her. Songs about stars and angels and children safe in their mother's arms. She told stories about her own mother, about Nonna Julia, about all the women who had loved and lost and somehow survived. She braided Lucia's tangled hair and made up silly games and sat through endless tantrums without ever leaving. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the storms began to pass faster. The nights grew quieter. The screams turned to whimpers, and the whimpers turned to silence, and eventually, miraculously, the silence turned to sleep. And sometimes, in the mornings, there were smiles. Small ones at first, hesitant and fragile as new butterflies, but real. Marco watched it all. He appeared at the nursery door each evening, still in his suit from whatever business had consumed his day, observing Sarah and Lucia with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't interrupt, didn't insert himself, just stood there in the doorway, a shadow at the edge of their small, fragile world, watching his daughter come back to life, one smile at a time. One evening, 3 weeks in, Lucia looked up from the story Sarah was telling, a tale about a brave princess who could talk to the stars, and saw her father in the doorway. Instead of screaming or crying or hiding under the covers, she said something that made Sarah's heart stop. "Papa can stay." Marco's face transformed. The armor cracked wide open, and beneath it was something raw and wondering and desperately hopeful. He crossed the room and sank down on the nursery rug, this man in his $1,000 suit, cross-legged on the floor like a child himself, and listened to Sarah finish the story with his daughter's hand clasped tightly in his own. When Lucia finally fell asleep between them, her small body warm and trusting, one hand holding her father's finger and the other clutching the worn rabbit, Marco looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're a miracle," he said softly. "You know that, right?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a miracle. I'm just someone who understands." Then, help me understand. He was close now, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his gray eyes, the tiny scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the exhaustion that had become as much a part of his face as the bones beneath. Help me understand how to be what she needs, how to reach her. Because I'm drowning, Sarah. I've been drowning since the day Elena died, and you're the first solid thing I've found to hold on to. His hand found hers in the dim light. The touch was electric, his rough palm against her fingers, warmth spreading up her arm and into her chest. "Danger," whispered a voice in her head. "This is dangerous," but she didn't pull away. She told herself it was for Lucia. The late-night conversations that stretched past midnight. Voices hushed so they wouldn't wake the sleeping child. The dinners that Marco insisted she share with the family. Just the three of them in a small breakfast room rather than the formal dining hall, eating simple food and talking about nothing and everything. The walks through the olive groves in the golden hour before sunset, Lucia running ahead to chase butterflies, while Marco asked Sierra about her grandmother, her childhood, the dreams she'd given up so long ago. She'd forgotten she'd ever had them. She told herself she was just a caretaker, just an employee, just a woman doing her job in a house full of shadows. But when he looked at her, really looked, the way no one had in years, she felt seen, valued, alive. "My mother doesn't like you," Marco said one evening. They were alone on the terrace, watching the sun sink into the Mediterranean in a blaze of orange and gold. Lucia was asleep upstairs, and the world had gone quiet and soft around them. Sarah stiffened. "I can reduce my hours with the family. Create more distance between. That's not what I want." He turned to face her, and in the golden light he looked almost gentle, almost human. "My mother is protective of the family name, of appearances, of the way things have always been done." His mouth twisted. "But she doesn't understand that Lucia needs someone real, someone with warmth and patience and—" He trailed off, his eyes searching her face. "Someone like you. Don Vitale. Marco." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "When we're alone, call me Marco." Marco. The name felt intimate on her tongue. Dangerous, like a spell that once spoken couldn't be taken back. "I'm your employee, Lucia's caretaker. Anything else would be—" "Would be what?" His hand rose, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so tender, so unexpectedly gentle, that it stole her breath. "Would be inappropriate? Scandalous? Impossible?" His thumb traced the line of her jaw, feather light. "I've built my entire life on impossible things, Sarah. On taking what the world said I couldn't have. She should step back, should remember her place, should remember who he was and who she was, and all the reasons this could never work. I'm not a prize to be taken." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm a person, with my own choices, my own will. I know." He didn't retreat. His gray eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she hadn't expected. Respect. "That's why I'm asking, not taking. What do you want, Sarah? Not what's proper, not what's safe, not what the world says you should want." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the space between. "What do you want?" The question cracked something open inside her, a door she'd locked so long ago she'd forgotten it was there. When had anyone last asked her that? When had she last let herself want anything beyond survival, beyond getting through another day? "I want," she faltered, searching for words. "I want to matter. To someone. I want to stop being invisible. I want. You matter." His voice was rough. "You matter so much. It terrifies me." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable. Soft at first. Questioning. His hands cupped her face like she was something precious, something he was afraid to break. She rose on her toes, fingers gripping the lapels of his jacket, and kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she'd buried for years. The terrace door slammed open. They sprang apart, Sarah's heart hammering so hard she could taste copper. Rosa Vitale stood in the doorway. The matriarch of the Vitale family was elegant even in her rage. Silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. Black dress immaculate. Single strand of pearls gleaming at her throat. But her aristocratic face was rigid with fury. her dark eyes blazing with cold fire. So, her voice could have frozen the Mediterranean. This is what you've become, Marco. Rutting with the help while your wife is barely cold in her grave. Mother, don't. Rosa raised one manicured hand. I want her gone. Tonight, before she destroys everything our family has built. Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. Signora Vitale, I apologize. I never meant. You'll apologize by leaving. Rosa's eyes were black ice. Enough. Marco's voice cracked like a whip. He moved to stand between Sarah and his mother, his body a shield. Sarah isn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Not ever. She's the only person who's been able to help Lucia, and I will not sacrifice my daughter's recovery for your pride or your prejudices. Rosa's face went white. Your father would be ashamed. My father is dead, and so is Elena. I'm the head of this family, Mother, and I make the decisions. Sarah stays. The matter is closed. Rosa stood frozen for a long moment, then quietly. You'll regret this. Both of you. She turned and disappeared into the house. Sarah was trembling. Marco, maybe she's right. Maybe I should. No. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like a shield against the world. No more running. No more hiding. We'll figure this out together. The incident happened 3 days later. Sarah was in the nursery reading to Lucia from a book of fairy tales when she heard it, shouting from somewhere deep in the house. Male voices raised in anger, then a crash, the sound of something heavy breaking. Lucia's face crumpled with fear. Papa, stay here, Piccina. Sarah rose quickly. Don't move until I come back. Promise me. She ran through the corridors. In the study, Marco faced down 3 rough-looking men, and behind them stood Enzo Carbone, Marco's uncle, the man who'd been circling the family since the funeral, whispering about Marco's fitness to lead. You're done, nephew. The council has decided. It's time for new leadership. The council takes orders from me, Enzo. Not anymore. Enzo nodded and the men advanced. No. Sarah's voice tore from her throat. Enzo's eyes locked onto her. The maid. Bring her. She'll make excellent motivation. Touch her, Marco said quietly, and I'll kill everyone in this room. But Marco was already moving. The fight was brutal and brief. Marco moved with devastating precision. In 40 seconds, 2 men were down. The third fled. Marco stood over his uncle with a knife at his throat. Get him out, Marco ordered. Lock him up. When the room emptied, Marco crossed to Sarah. His violent hands cupped her face with impossible gentleness. Did they hurt you? No. I didn't know you could do that. There are many things you don't know about me, Sarah. This is what I am. His voice hardened. If you want to leave, I understand. I'm not leaving, but is Lucia safe? Enzo acted alone. The council will fall in line. But his voice held uncertainty. The days that followed were tense. Marco was gone constantly. Rosa refused to speak to Sarah. The staff whispered, but Lucia thrived. She started speaking more, laughing more. Mama is in heaven, she told Sarah one afternoon. She's happy when I'm happy. Do you think she likes you? I want you to stay forever. The door opened. Rosa stood in the threshold. Leave us, she said to Lucia. When the child left, Rosa advanced. I know what you're doing. Worming your way into my granddaughter's heart, into my son's bed. I care about Lucia. You care about her inheritance. Rosa stepped closer. What's your game? There is no game. I sang a lullaby to a crying child. That's all. Something flickered in Rosa's face, then hardened. When you make a mistake, and you will, I'll be there. The truth about Elena surfaced on a Thursday, Sarah found a letter behind the dresser, addressed to Marco, dated 3 days before Elena's accident. My darling Marco, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I'm taking Lucia. I can't raise our daughter in the shadow of your work. Your uncle has helped me arrange everything. New identities. A place to disappear. Forgive me. Elena. Enzo had helped Elena try to run. Elena's accident wasn't an accident. She ran to Marco's study. I found this. I think Elena was trying to leave you, and I think Enzo killed her. Marco read the letter. His face went white. Where did you get this? My room. It was hidden. Your room. The room that belonged to Elena's personal maid. The woman who was found dead 2 weeks after the funeral. He looked up with stranger's eyes. How convenient. You show up out of nowhere. You charm my daughter. You seduce me. And now you find the one piece of evidence that could tear my family apart? You can't think I'm involved. I don't know what to think anymore. His voice cracked. Get out. Marco, get out. Guards gripped her arms. She was pulled from the house into the dark. 3 days in a cheap hotel in Palermo. On the third night, a text from an unknown number. He took her. Lucia. Enzo escaped and took her. Marco walked into a trap. Dockside warehouse. Come now if you want them alive. Every instinct screamed it was a setup, but Lucia's face swam before her eyes. Sarah grabbed her coat and ran. The warehouse loomed against the night sky. She slipped through a side door with a kitchen knife, pathetic against whatever waited inside, and saw. Marco was on his knees, hands bound, blood streaming from his forehead. A dozen armed men surrounded him. Enzo sat on a chair with Lucia trembling on his lap. Brought low by a woman, Enzo was saying. I planted that letter months ago. Waited for the right distraction. Love makes fools of us all. Sarah looked around. Oil drums, a rusted chain, a catwalk above with a fire axe in a glass case. She began to climb. The catwalk creaked. No one looked up. She smashed the glass, crept along until she was directly above Enzo. Any last words? Enzo asked Marco. Just one. Look up. Enzo's head tilted back just as Sarah swung. The axe severed the crane chain. 20 pounds of rusted metal crashed down on the guards. Chaos erupted. Sarah slid down a beam and ran for Lucia. Sarah! The child's arms wrapped around her neck. I knew you'd come. Hold on. Don't let go. She ran. A hand caught her ankle. She went down hard. Enzo's face appeared above her, maddened, bloody, triumphant. You think you can take what's mine? He raised a gun. The shot came from behind. Enzo looked down at the red bloom on his chest, then crumpled. Marco stood 10 feet away, weapon raised. His men flooded through the doors. Sarah! He pulled her and Lucia into his arms. I'm so sorry. Later. Just get us out of here. Dawn found them at the estate. Lucia was asleep in Marco's arms, exhausted but unharmed. Sarah sat beside them, her injured shoulder bound with someone's jacket, watching the sun rise over the olive groves. I should have trusted you. Marco's voice was barely a whisper. I read the fear in your face and I chose to see betrayal instead. There's no excuse. No, there isn't. But I'm asking you to forgive me, to stay, because I need you too, because these past 3 days without you were worse than any wound Enzo could have given me. Sarah looked at him, at the man who had thrown her out, who had broken her heart, who had come back for his daughter with death in his eyes. You don't get to do that again, she said. You don't get to shut me out when things get hard. If I stay, I'm not just the help. I know. And if you ever make me think you're going to hurt me again, I'm taking Lucia and we're both disappearing. Are we clear? Marco reached for her hand. His grip was fierce. "We're clear. I swear on my daughter's life. You will never have to run from me again." Lucia stirred. Her eyes found Sarah, and a sleepy smile spread across her face. "You stayed. I knew you would." Sarah kissed her forehead. "Always, Piccina. Always." 6 months later, the estate was transformed. Lucia's laughter rang through the corridors. Even Rosa had begun to soften, and Sarah had found her place. She was no longer a maid, no longer just a caretaker. Lucia called her something that made Sarah's heart ache every time she heard it. "Mama Sarah." The little girl came running with a crayon drawing. A house, 3 figures holding hands. Above them, Famiglia. "It's beautiful, Piccina. We're a new kind of family. Papa said so." Marco stood in the doorway. "She's right. We're not like other families. We're better." He set Lucia down, reached into his pocket, and sank to one knee. Sarah's heart stopped. 6 months ago, a maid sang a song I hadn't heard since my mother was alive. She gave me hope. He opened the box, a diamond surrounded by sapphires. She gave me a reason to be better. "Sarah Ferrante, will you marry me?" "Say yes," Lucia bounced. "Say yes, say yes." Sarah laughed through tears. "Yes, yes, you impossible man. Yes." He slid the ring on, a perfect fit, and kissed her while Lucia cheered. "I have one more surprise." He led her to a small chapel. On the altar, photographs, her parents, her grandmother, Elena holding baby Lucia, all the people they'd lost, gathered together. "I thought they should be here. Our family, the whole family, living and gone, together at last." Sarah touched her grandmother's photograph. "Nonna Giulia," she whispered. "I found him, with a lullaby." Lucia tugged her hand. "Can I tell you a secret? Sometimes I dream about Mama. She tells me she's happy, that she picked you for us. She says thank you for the lullaby." Sarah pulled her close and let the tears come. That evening, as the sun set over the Mediterranean, Sarah stood on the terrace with her ring gleaming. Marco appeared with wine. "Regrets? I used to think my life was a series of losses, but now I wonder if all of it was just the path that led me here. To a man with too many enemies? To a little girl who needed someone to sing to her?" She smiled. "To a man who was brave enough to cry." He laughed. "I'm never living that down. Not a chance." He kissed her, "For better or worse, until death do us part. That's supposed to come at the wedding. I'm Sicilian. We don't do modest." If you were Sarah, faced with the choice to walk into danger or walk away, would you have opened that door? Would you have sung the lullaby? Or would you have stayed invisible and stayed safe? Tell me in the comments.